Naomi Klein has a new book out, On Fire, and she drops by our studio to talk with me this morning. Check this out. It's extraordinary. And don't forget to leave your comments, ding the bell, share this with your friends, and sign up for our channel. In the studio with me, which is like super cool, is Naomi Klein. She has a new book out, On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal. Tonight, she and I will be at, well, you will principally be, I'll be kind of emceeing, I guess, the thing, tonight at Powell's Books in Beaverton. And then, and that's today's Wednesday. Tomorrow, Thursday, you're going to be in Oakland at the First Congregational Church. Friday, you're going to be in San Mateo. Saturday, you're going to be in Chico, California. I have done these kinds of book tours. In fact, I did one just 3 months ago for my book on guns. And boy, it just runs you ragged. I wish you the very best on this, Naomi. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Tom.
And NaomiKlein.org, by the way, if you want to get tickets or you want more information on this.
Yeah,
you have written about
Coast.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm traveling less these days, so it's fun. I haven't done a West Coast speaking tour in a while. So
good.
It's nice to be back and
I'm glad you like
reconnect
it.
with folks.
I'm glad you like it. You and I have talked over the years about a variety of things, from capitalism to climate, and your book brings a lot of this stuff together, whether it was no logo or shock doctrine or this changes everything, just brilliant writing that you do. What's the principal message of On Fire?
Well, I think the most important thing to understand about the moment we're at is that we are living a time of three fires. We've got the climate fires, whether it's in the Pacific Northwest, every summer, these seasons of smoke. We're seeing wildfires in the Arctic, Siberia, places where you're not supposed to have wildfires. As Greta Thunberg says, our house is on fire, and we've known this for a long time. But that's not the only kind of fires we are facing. We also have the political fires of the far right that increasingly are building political power by creating this in-group, the protected in-group, and then all of these out-group others, and pitting the in-group against the out-group at the border.
Give me an example of what you're talking about.
Well, in the United States, it's obvious with Trump and the specter of the invading army of immigrants. But he's been palling around with Modi lately, and Modi does the same thing with the in-group of Hindus, the out-groups of Muslims. We see a similar MO with a lot of these figures, the sort of militarization of whole of borders, mass incarceration of these out-group others. It keeps people fighting with each other, and it keeps them free to plunder. I mean, Bolsonaro is doing the same thing in Brazil. And there is an outright war on truth, on fact. Bolsonaro just addressed the United Nations and said the Amazon wasn't on fire, actually. It's just a big misinformation campaign. I think there's a connection between these sort of the rise of the far right and the fact that we are in this moment where the climate crisis is no longer a future crisis. We're living it. We're in it. I think people understand that we are now in an era where more and more people are going to be on the move, looking for safety, looking to share the remaining habitable places on our planet. And I think that's why we are seeing a resurgence of ideologies that just explicitly rank human life. These people are better than those people. And if that's true, well, then it's okay to let them drown, to let them die, to lock them up indefinitely. And we're seeing this. We're seeing it in the Mediterranean. We're seeing it with the Australian government, with their offshore migration detention camps. So there is a third fire as well, which is the fires of this growing climate justice movement. And we just saw it burn pretty brightly on Monday with 4 million people around the world participating in these youth-organized climate strikes, but not just young people, adults joining, different sectors joining, like tech workers. And so it's kind of a race against time because we have a little bit more than a decade to cut global emissions in half if we are going to preserve, anything like a habitable planet. So, that's, I guess, the message of my book is that third fire, the fire of our movements, has to be powerful enough to take on the fires of the far right. And I really think it's a Green New Deal that is our ticket for building that kind of broad movement, that broad coalition.
And I want to get to that in just a moment, but here in the United States, we're actually seeing climate refugees on our southern border. I mean, I'd read this stuff, but then NBC went down to Guatemala and tracked back into some of these remote parts of Guatemala that a lot of these refugees are coming from, and found literally places where people were starving to death because they're in the 5th year of a drought, and there's literally no food. They've been eating grass and tree barks and things. And this is the source of many of these people who are on our southern border, that Donald Trump is throwing their children in jail and passing out billions of dollars to his buddies in the private prison industry.
Even as he cuts hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to Central America, much of which was going to help farmers who are dealing with drought.
Right, and none of this is ever talked about in the context of climate change refugees.
Yeah. No, and I think they're very conscious of it, though, because if you look at what the Trump administration has done with its immigration policy, one of the first things they did is take aim at TPS, temporary protected status, right? First for Haitians, then for Salvadorans. So these are millions of people who are in the United States under a program that provides status, temporary status, to people who are displaced by some sort of extreme event in their countries.
In other words, refugees.
Yes, refugees, but specifically refugees from, and it lists the basis on which you can get temporary protected status. Can be war, which is true for other ways of getting a refugee status, but it specifically lists natural disasters. And that's very significant because climate refugees, we're talking about them, but climate refugees actually don't exist under international law. There is no such thing as a climate refugee under international refugee law. It's outdated because the conventions were written before climate change.
You can have a refugee from an earthquake.
Well, you actually can't. Refugees from wars, you can get refugee status because of human rights abuses, but not because of natural disasters. But TPS was an exception. TPS, like people from Haiti in the United States, got TPS because of the earthquake in Haiti, and so they have really understood that this is a loophole. TPS is a loophole.
They being the
Trump administration that allows people to get status because of natural disasters. Now, earthquakes aren't connected to climate change, but superstorms are. And we just saw with the Bahamas that people are being refused entry to the United States, and Trump is calling them drug dealers. In the aftermath of a Category 5 hurricane. Right? So I think they absolutely understand that more and more people are going to be seeking haven because of the climate crisis, and this is their climate change adaptation. Their plan is the fortressing of the borders, and it's getting more and more explicit.
As much as anybody I know, you're a citizen of the world. I'm curious your thoughts on this whole impeachment falderall here, this transcript that we've been talking about in the last hour, the whistleblowers, how the world views this, how we should be viewing this.
Right. I mean, well, first of all, I think it's a very good thing that finally Nancy Pelosi has decided that enough is enough and has begun impeachment proceedings. I think it could have begun before. I'm glad it's happening now. I'm glad it's and I do think that even though we know that the Senate is not going to impeach him, this will hurt him, despite their bravado. Oh, it's going to help our reelection. It's not. I don't think it's going to help. And I think anything that keeps Trump from getting a second term is incredibly important, because one of the things I feel like people sometimes underestimate is just what that second term would look like. You look at Modi, for instance. He just got his second term. Modi's second term is not a continuation of his first term.
Right, it's like unleashed.
Utterly unleashed.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Green New Deal for a minute, if that's all right.
Yeah.
It's in the subtitle of your book. I was listening to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about this morning on NPR, and she was saying, you know, this is really a superstructure, an infrastructure. It's not, the specifics are not there yet. It's really a set of goals.
Right.
You want to speak to that and how you conceptualize the Green New Deal?
Right. So I think that's exactly right. It is not a singular climate policy like cap and trade or a carbon tax. It is the plan for the next economy. In the same way that the original New Deal, you know, from which the Green New Deal takes its name, was not one policy. It was the governing structure of FDR's administration until the war. There were multiple programs within it, huge infrastructure programs that electrified rural America. There was Social Security. There was unemployment insurance. There was the breaking up of the banks. I mean, these were all New Deal policies. So I think we have to get out of the idea that the Green New Deal is just one thing. Mm-hmm. It is the framework for how the U.S. economy should work in the context of a carbon-constrained world. Mm-hmm. So last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the scientific body that was created by the United Nations in order to advise governments about the scientific consensus on climate change, what they should expect, what our carbon budget is. I stress this to say, because that means they're a very conservative body. This is not like one lone scientific paper published in a journal. This is the work of thousands of scientists collaborating, coming to a consensus document that doesn't get released until the governments sign off on that document. So that body.
And I think a lot of people don't understand what the word consensus means and why that's actually in some ways working against us.
Well,
basically means any one person can veto the entire thing.
Well, it's true, and it does tend to make these reports more conservative, right? Than you would have if you went through a normal peer review process. There are checks and balances, but there are so many more checks and balances for a body like the IPCC to come out with a report like they did last October about what it would take to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which, given what we're seeing with warming of 1 degree Celsius, which is where we're at right now. They're saying that it'd be exceedingly dangerous to allow more warming than 1.5. Okay, so what they said is if we want to do this, we need to cut global emissions in half in the next 12 years. So that was a year ago. That means that now we have 11 years, and so 11 years from now, the whole global economy needs to have halved its greenhouse gas emissions. That is very, very, very difficult to do. So the Green New Deal resolution that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey released a few months ago begins with that deadline.
Naomi Klein is in the studio with us talking about the Green New Deal and her new book On Fire, and she's on book tour. She'll be here in Portland tonight at Powell's in Beaverton, if you're in the neighborhood. And tomorrow in Oakland, the day after San Mateo, the day after that Chico, and then on to New Jersey, Illinois, Texas, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Wow, you're all bouncing all over.
Good God.
Yeah. So we were just talking about the Green New Deal, and you were basically summarizing it as this is the structure within which the United States can start to meet the UN goals of within 11 years cutting worldwide carbon emissions in half. Do I have that right?
Exactly. So the first thing that this plan needs to do is get to zero emissions as quickly as possible. Because even though the whole world has 12 years to cut it in half, countries like the United States that have been emitting at the highest level for longest actually have to do it faster. So it's a big lift, but. The philosophy of this type of approach is, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has said it very well, it's a war on poverty at the same time, right? It recognizes that we don't just live at a time where we have a carbon crisis. We also have an economic inequality crisis. We have a racial injustice crisis. We have a crisis of gender exclusion and gender violence. We've got all manner of crises, and we are not going to get anywhere by trying to pit them against each other and saying, my crisis is bigger than your crisis. What a Green New Deal is saying is if we do have to change everything about how we live in cities, about how we move ourselves around, what transportation we use, if we have to change how we get our energy, why wouldn't we seize this opportunity where we're changing things anyway to very deliberately battle these systemic crises of various forms of inequality in our societies?
And it's a reasonable question, and it seems that the answer is because there's a bunch of billionaires out there who are making a hell of a lot of money on fossil fuels, and they don't want this to happen.
Right, and I think that that's precisely why we need this intersectional, holistic vision that is going to offer a lot to those people in the United States who have the rawest deal right now, who have the weakest public services, that aren't served by public transit, that are living in crumbling public housing, who have lead in their water, who are being sacrificed already, because this is the fight of our lives. Fossil fuel companies are going, and the banks that fund them, will continue to fight like hell to protect a business model that is at war with life on Earth. They will fight whatever climate policies we put forward, as they have, right? So we need to build an army. We need to build a coalition that will fight for this alternative, not just because it's better than climate apocalypse, but because it's better than what they have right now. I hear this criticism from, friends in the climate movement who are like, why are you making this harder? Why are you adding all this justice stuff? Fighting climate change is hard enough. Why are you making it about racial justice and fixing fighting capitalism and fixing the economy? And my argument is, this is how we win, because we don't win by having a sort of comfortable middle-class white climate movement, which we've had for too long. We win by merging all of these vibrant movements, whether it's the immigrant rights movement, the Black Lives Matter, so many people who are fighting for basic rights in this country. If they're able to see a better future for themselves in a justice-based transition off of fossil fuels, then they'll fight for it, and they'll fight hard. Because when people are fighting for homes, jobs, healthy air and water for their kids, they fight really, really hard.
We have just a minute till we hit a break here. Are you seeing an intersection between this and your book, Shock Doctrine?
Thom, I feel like everything I've done since I wrote Shock Doctrine, it came out in 2007, has been an attempt to prevent the shock doctrine from repeating itself, right? This strategy that I described, where in times of crisis, in times of shock, what we see again and again is wealthy interests descending and using people's fear and dislocation to push through policies that create more inequality, more exclusion, more violence. I started writing about climate change after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, because I saw what our current system produces, which is not just more climate change. It's more inequality, more racial injustice, more privatization. In New Orleans, the schools were privatized, the hospitals were closed down, the public housing was bulldozed. That is how our system responds to climate change now, right? Just with more barbarism, with more brutality. So I see this as the anti-shock doctrine. I see this as the people's plan for how we're going to actually get at the root causes for why we're getting all these shocks in the first place.